Good morning, boys and girls. Today we're going to do a making meaning lesson. And last week we talked about the story Flight, which was about Charles Lindbergh and how he was the first man to cross the Atlantic Ocean in his airplane. And today we're going to talk about the picture book of Amelia Earhart. So this is a biography where Flight was a small moment story. So in the biography, we're going to go through the timeline of her life. And Amelia Earhart was the first woman to cross the Atlantic Ocean not long after Charles Lindbergh. She completed many other pioneering flights that affected the way people thought about women and what women are capable of. So she really ended up being a wonderful person in history. Some words that we're going to talk about today are absorbed. So she absorbed knowledge, she took in knowledge, and she learned from things. Domestic robot. Domestic was a word that referred to women just working out of the home, their responsibilities for keeping the house clean and for taking care of a family. Times have changed since then. Pontoons are special objects that would go on the bottom of the plane so that if they needed to land on the water, they could safely. I'm sure you've probably heard of pontoon boats. Stationary means, it's a double definition word. It means to sit still, like if you were to sit stationary, but it also means like a special type of paper to write letters on. And endorsements. Think about maybe one of your favorite athletes, and maybe they wear Nike all the time or they wear Adidas. So they are endorsing that brand because that brand is providing financial assistance to them. So when she gets endorsements, people are helping her financially with her airplane and taking care of it and the expense that goes along with that. Aviation is like the science of building airplanes and flying airplanes. And at the end of the story, they refer to the word pop-off, which means to pass away or to die. So let's get started on the picture book of Amelia Earhart by David Adler. And again, it's a biography, so we're going to go through the timeline of her life. Amelia Earhart was born in Atchison, Kansas on July 24th, 1897. Her parents were Edwin Earhart, a lawyer for a railroad, and Amy Earhart, the daughter of a wealthy judge. In 1900, the Earharts had a second daughter, Muriel. Amelia was not a quiet schoolgirl. She threw mud balls and jumped over fences. She played baseball and football and shot her own .22 rifle to rid the family's barn of rats. When she was 7, she made her own roller coaster using fence rails and a pair of old roller skates. Although other girls her age wore long ruffled dresses, Amelia and Muriel Earhart often wore loose-fitted pants called bloomers. The Earhart girls' behavior was shocking to some people, but Amelia later wrote, "Some elders have to be shocked, for everybody's good now and then." So here she is having all fun. She's dressing a little more casual, and here's the way that the women dressed back then. Amelia was 11 years old when she first saw an airplane. It was 1908. 5 years after the Wright brothers made their first successful flight. Amelia wrote later that at the time she thought it was just a thing of rusty wire and wood, not at all interesting. After high school, Amelia went to Ognott School in Pennsylvania. Amelia was tall and thin. In a letter to her parents from school, she drew a sketch of herself dressed in a suit with a pleated skirt and wrote, "I look like a broomstick wrapped round and round." And she wrote, "Did I tell you that I have a reputation for brains?" So she's known for being very smart. Amelia spent Christmas 1917 with her sister in Toronto, Canada. There she saw soldiers who had returned from the First World War. Years later she wrote, "For the first time I realized that the World War meant, instead of new uniforms and brass bands, I only saw results of 4 years' desperate struggle. Men without arms and legs, men who were paralyzed, and men who were blind." Soon after the holiday, Amelia quit school. She went back to Toronto, became a nurse's aide, and cared for the wounded. about how Amelia's changed in the story. So she was, you know, a fun young child who liked to play sports and was a little different than the other girls. And then she became interested in airplanes, and that kind of stuck in her head. Then she went off to college, and now she's, you know, helping take care of the wounded from the war. While Amelia was in Toronto, she went to a nearby airfield that had another look at airplanes. Some years later, she explained that though I had seen one or two at county fairs before, now I saw so many of them. I hung around them in my spare time and absorbed all I could. So she was taking in all the information that she was seeing and maybe overhearing people talking about airplanes, and she was learning about them. After the war, Amelia studied automobile engineer repair. The next year, she took courses at New York City at Columbia University and Barnard College. At first, she was preparing to study medicine. Later, she decided to do medical research. So she was interested in airplanes, and now she's more involved in medicine. After the school year had ended, Amelia went to be with her parents who had moved to California. On Christmas Day in 1920, she went to an air show, and 3 days later, she paid $1 for a 10-minute airplane ride. As soon as I left the ground, she wrote later, I knew I myself had to fly. In January of 1921, Amelia took her first flying lesson. In July, she bought her first airplane. She paid for the lessons and airplane with money she earned working for the Los Angeles Telephone Company and with money given and loaned to her by her mother and sister. Flying wasn't as safe then as it is today. Airplanes were powered by small engines. Amelia had several crash landings. Once she was thrown into an open field. Another time her airplane turned over in heavy rain, and Amelia, held in by her safety belt, hung upside down. In 1924, Amelia's parents divorced. She sold her airplane and bought a yellow sports car and drove her mother east to their new home in Medford, Massachusetts. Sam Chapman, a chemical engineer, followed Amelia east. Chapman wanted Amelia to marry him, but Amelia refused to become what she called a domestic robot. At the time, she said, I don't want to marry anyone. On weekdays, Amelia had a job as a social worker in a community center in nearby Boston, teaching English to immigrant children. On weekends, she flew for sport and was a saleswoman for an airplane builder. So here's the gentleman, Sam Chapman, that was interested in marrying her, and she said no. In May of 1927, Charles Lindbergh became the first to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. The next year, Amelia Earhart became the first woman to make the flight. She was a co-passenger aboard in an airplane named Friendship. In June of 1928, Amelia, Bill Schultz, and Slim Gordon climbed into the Friendship. It was painted orange so it would be easy to find in case of an accident, and was fitted with pontoons so they could complete the trip. They could land on the ocean. Before the trip, Amelia telegraphed her mother, "Don't worry, no matter what happens, it will have been worth trying." While Schultz flew the plane, Amelia checked maps and kept a record of their speed and altitude. She also looked out the window at clouds she described as marvelous shapes of white. She was, she wrote, gulping beauty. In June 18th of 1928, after 20 hours and 45 minutes in the air, the plane landed in the water in the harbor of Burrow, Port Wales. Amelia described the flight as a grand experience, but since she didn't pilot the plane, she felt like baggage. So she didn't feel as important because she wasn't flying the plane. She just felt like she was sitting in the back here and she was baggage like a suitcase. When the three flyers returned to New York, they were given keys to the city. They were driven in open cars in a parade down Broadway. People leaned out office windows and looked and threw down confetti to celebrate. Amelia Earhart was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. She was an American hero. Amelia Earhart wrote a book and newspaper and magazine articles. She gave lectures and allowed her name to be used on luggage, clothing, stationery, and in advertisements. In her speeches, she spoke against war and for the rights of women. Her schedule and endorsements were managed by her book publisher, George Putman. On February 7th in 1931, Putman became more than her publisher. He became her husband. Early the next year at breakfast, Amelia told him she wanted to fly across the Atlantic Ocean again. This time, she would be the pilot of the airplane. She would go alone. Amelia Earhart took off in a red and gold single-engine airplane from Harbor Grace, Newfoundland, on May 20th, 1932. She flew through strong winds, heavy rain, thick clouds, and even with the wings and windshield of her airplane covered with slush and ice until she landed the next afternoon in the pasture in Londonderry, North Ireland. She said later that her landing frightened all the cows in the neighborhood. "Have you come far?" the first person to see her asked. "From America," Amelia Earhart told him. "Have you now?" the man said, not sure he could believe her. So here she is. She landed in the field, and there's those cows. With this flight, Amelia Earhart became the very first woman and just the second person after Charles Lindbergh to fly alone across the Atlantic Ocean. She became one of the most celebrated people of her time. In June, President Herbert Hoover presented her with a gold medal, one of many awards she received in her great achievement. They called her a pioneering woman. Amelia Earhart said that she just hoped her flight has meant something to women in aviation. It did. Amelia Earhart, many daring adventures meant a lot to women in all different fields. Amelia Earhart had other flying adventures. In January in 1932, she became the first to fly from Hawaii to California. With that flight, she also became the first to fly alone across both the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. In April, she became the first to fly alone from Los Angeles to Mexico City. In 1937, she planned to fly around the world. When she was told the flight was dangerous, Amelia said, "I've wanted to do this for a long time. If I should pop off, it would be doing things that I have always wanted to do." On June 1st, 1937, Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, began the trip. They flew from Miami, Florida to San Juan, Puerto Rico. They flew to South America and then to Africa, India, Burma, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Australia, and New Guinea. She had gone more than 3/4 around the world. And on June 2nd, they took off from New Guinea for the Howland Islands, a tiny island in the vast Pacific Ocean. They never made it. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan disappeared somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. There was an enormous search, but they never found them. Before she was lost, Amelia wrote to her husband, "I'm quite aware of the hazards. I want to do it. Women must try to do things as men have tried. When they fail, their failures must be but a challenge to others." Amelia Earhart was America's first lady of the air. She was a courageous flyer, a pioneer. She risked her life to prove that in the air and elsewhere, women were up to the challenge, and she certainly was. And there you have the picture book of Amelia Earhart.